I always thought of myself as someone who trusted people too easily. Maybe because I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other and neighbours would bring over pies or mow your lawn if you were sick. When I moved into this neighbourhood a few years ago, I wanted to hold on to that same sense of trust, to believe that people around me were decent and kind. At first, it even felt that way. The houses were close enough that you could wave to each other across the street. Kids rode their bikes on the sidewalks, and the older couples took evening walks hand in hand. It looked like the perfect little slice of suburban life. I never locked my mailbox. It wasn't one of those community units with keys, just the classic metal box on a wooden post by the driveway. And it never occurred to me that anyone would touch what wasn't theirs. That changed the morning I was waiting for an important package. It was a small box, nothing fancy, but inside was a necklace that belonged to my grandmother. I'd sent it off to be repaired because the clasp had broken. I was almost nervous waiting for it to come back, not because of the value, but because of the memories it carried. Every day that week, I checked the tracking number, refreshing it on my phone like it was a lifeline. When the notification finally said delivered, I rushed outside, expecting to see the little box sitting there, but the mailbox was empty. At first, I convinced myself maybe the mailman scanned it early and would drop it off later. I kept pacing, looking out the window every few minutes, telling myself not to overreact. But as the hours went by, that anxious voice in my head grew louder. That evening, I walked down the street, peeking into neighbours' yards like maybe it had been misdelivered, but I didn't see anything. I remember coming back inside, sitting at the kitchen table with my head in my hands and feeling this pit in my stomach. It wasn't just frustration. It was the fear that something more personal had been taken from me. A few days later, it happened again. Another package disappeared. This time, just some vitamins I ordered online, nothing sentimental, but still annoying. That was when I started paying closer attention. I tried to tell myself it could be random mistakes, maybe the delivery service dropping things at the wrong address, but something inside me whispered it wasn't that simple. I noticed my neighbour across the street, Janice, always seemed to be outside around the same time deliveries came. She would linger by her flower beds, pulling weeds that weren't really there or sweeping the same spot on her porch. I brushed it off because it felt ridiculous to accuse someone of stealing without proof. Still, once the thought was planted, it grew like a weed I couldn't pull out. I started remembering little moments, like the time she made a joke about how many boxes I got from Amazon, or when she once asked me, too casually, if I'd ever lost a delivery before. At night, I would lie in bed replaying these interactions, wondering if I was imagining things or if I was finally seeing something that had been happening for longer than I knew. The next week, I decided I wasn't going to sit around feeling paranoid anymore. I wanted answers, and the only way to get them was to pay attention. So I started changing my routine. Normally I'd work in my office upstairs, where I couldn't see the mailbox unless I went to the window. But now I dragged my laptop down to the kitchen table. From there I had a perfect view through the blinds, and I kept them tilted just enough to peek without being obvious. I felt silly at first, like some kind of spy in my own house. But the more I thought about the necklace and the missing packages, the more justified it felt. A couple of days went by with nothing unusual. Mail came, I went out, everything seemed fine. And then, one afternoon, it happened. The delivery truck pulled up and left a small padded envelope in my box. I recognised it because it was a book I'd ordered, something I needed for work. I waited a few minutes, thinking I'd just grab it after I finished my email, when I saw movement across the street. Janice. She was in her yard again, pretending to be busy with her roses. I froze, barely breathing as I watched her glance around, then casually stroll across the street like she was just taking a walk. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. She slowed down near my driveway, hesitated, then reached into my mailbox as if she owned it. In one smooth motion, she pulled out the envelope and slipped it under her sweater. Then she turned and walked back toward her porch like nothing had happened. I sat there in shock. For a second, I honestly questioned if I'd seen what I saw. Maybe she was returning mail that got mixed up. Maybe she had some kind of explanation. But deep down, I knew there wasn't one. She had stolen from me, plain and simple. And the violation I felt in that moment was overwhelming. I wanted to run outside and scream at her, to demand she give it back, but something stopped me. Maybe it was disbelief, maybe fear of causing a scene, or maybe it was the realization that now I had proof in my own eyes. I decided not to confront her yet. Instead, I went outside later, pretending I hadn't noticed, and checked the mailbox. Empty. That was all I needed to confirm the truth. The rest of that day, I walked around in a haze. Every time I passed a window, I found myself glaring at her house, wondering how long she'd been doing this, how many things of mine she had taken, and what kind of person steals from a neighbour they wave to every morning. I thought about the conversations we'd had over the years, the times she'd smiled and acted friendly, and each memory made me feel sick. It was like realizing someone had been lying to my face all along. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the image of her hand reaching into my mailbox over and over until it felt burned into my brain. I needed to do something, but I didn't know what. Calling the police felt extreme without any hard evidence beyond my word. Yelling at her would just give her a chance to deny it. I needed a plan. Something that would make sure she couldn't wriggle out of the truth. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the streetlight seeping through my curtains, and I promised myself one thing. I wasn't going to let her get away with this again. The following morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest. The kind you feel when something isn't right in your world. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out the window at her house. Everything looked so normal. Her flower pots neatly arranged on the porch, her flag fluttering in the breeze, her little dog barking at every passing car. Anyone else would have seen a perfectly ordinary suburban home. But to me, it had changed overnight. It was the place where my trust had been broken. I thought about my grandmother's necklace again and felt a surge of anger that nearly brought me to tears. I wasn't just angry at Janice. I was angry at myself for being so naive. I had let my guard down because I wanted to believe people were good, and she had taken advantage of that. As the day went on, my mind kept circling around one idea. I needed proof. Without it, I'd always wonder if I had imagined it or exaggerated what I saw. So I started researching. I spent hours online reading about home security cameras, motion detectors, even little spy gadgets that could fit inside a mailbox. I laughed at myself for a moment, me sitting there like some wannabe detective. But then I realised this wasn't funny. This was my life, my home, and I had every right to protect it. That evening, I drove to the electronics store and bought a small camera that could be hidden in plain sight. The clerk probably thought I was just paranoid about porch pirates, but to me, this was personal. On the drive back, I kept glancing at her house as I pulled into my driveway, wondering if she had any idea that her little game was about to end. That night, after the street grew quiet, I set up the camera near the front window, with a clear view of the mailbox. My hands trembled as I adjusted the angle. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, "Please let this work." The next day, I felt a mix of dread and excitement. I knew the mail usually came around 1 p.m, so I waited, Right on schedule, the truck pulled up and left a small package. My pulse quickened as I watched through the blinds. At first, nothing happened. Then, like clockwork, Janice appeared again, pretending to fuss with her garden. I felt my stomach twist when she looked around, walked straight across the street, and reached into my mailbox. She tucked the package under her arm and headed back toward her porch, all in less than 30 seconds. I wanted to scream, but instead I stayed frozen until she disappeared inside. Only then did I grab my laptop and check the camera feed. And there it was, clear as day. Her hand in my mailbox, her face turned just enough for the camera to catch her expression. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't panicked. She looked casual, almost smug, like it was routine. Seeing that footage broke something inside me. It wasn't just about packages anymore. It was about betrayal. I saved the video immediately, my hands shaking as I made copies on a USB drive and my phone. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little in control again. I finally had proof. Still, as I sat there staring at the frozen frame of her stealing from me, I wondered what kind of person she really was. Did she do this to others? Did she justify it in her mind somehow? Or was I just the unlucky neighbour she decided to target? When I had that video saved on my phone, I must have replayed it 20 times in a row. Each time I watched her slip her hand into my mailbox, the pit in my stomach grew deeper. It was no longer a suspicion or a fleeting thought. It was undeniable. The betrayal felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I thought about all the times we'd exchanged small talk over the fence, how she had once asked to borrow sugar, how she complimented my Christmas decorations. All of those memories twisted in my mind until they felt fake, like every smile she'd given me was just a cover for the truth. That night, as I sat on the couch with the video playing on loop, I started debating what to do. Part of me wanted to storm over there right away, knock on her door and shove the phone in her face. Another part of me wanted to take the footage straight to the police. But then there was a quieter voice inside me that urged patience. If she had been stealing from me for this long, one video might not be enough. I needed to be sure, to collect more than one incident, to build something she couldn't deny or excuse. The next few days became a strange routine. Packages came, and like clockwork, she took them. I filmed everything, saving each clip carefully. Sometimes I would sit by the window and watch it happen in real time, my hands gripping the blinds so tightly my knuckles turned white. Other times I couldn't bear to see it live, so I waited until later to check the footage. Each theft chipped away at me, but it also fueled me. By the end of the week, I had a small collection of videos. Different days, different packages, the same neighbour, the same crime. It was undeniable. What shocked me the most was how casual she was about it. There was no hesitation, no glancing around nervously. She acted like it was her right, like my mailbox belonged to her. It made me wonder how many times she had gotten away with this before I noticed. I couldn't help but think about the necklace again, about whether it was sitting somewhere in her house right now, hidden in a drawer or tossed aside without a thought. The idea made me sick. I started noticing other little things too. Sometimes when I'd drive home from work, I'd see her car pulling into her driveway with shopping bags, and I'd catch myself wondering if some of those things had been mine. I hated how paranoid I was becoming, how every movement she made seemed suspicious. But then I'd remind myself she had earned that suspicion. She had broken something that couldn't easily be fixed. One evening, as I stood outside taking the trash to the curb, she waved at me like nothing was wrong. I forced myself to wave back, but inside I felt like screaming. How dare she act so friendly after stealing from me over and over? That was the moment I knew I couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about the stolen items anymore. It was about respect, about standing up for myself. I had the evidence I needed, but I still hadn't decided how I was going to use it. Police? Public confrontation? Some other way of making sure she understood what she had done? I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling again, realizing that the next move I made would change everything between us. The weight of carrying those videos on my phone was exhausting. It felt like I was holding a secret that burned hotter every day. Every time I saw her outside watering her flowers or chatting with another neighbour, my stomach twisted. I wanted to yell out, to let everyone know what she was doing. But I kept myself quiet. I needed to be careful. One wrong move and she could deny everything, maybe even try to turn the blame on me. So I kept collecting evidence. A few more deliveries came that week, and just like before, she took them without hesitation. I had 6 different clips by then, each one a little different, but all telling the same story. One afternoon, while replaying them, I noticed something that made my blood boil. She didn't even look nervous anymore. In one video, she actually glanced toward my window and smirked, like she knew I couldn't do anything to stop her. That smirk kept me awake for nights. I began imagining scenarios in my head. Sometimes I pictured walking into her yard during one of her thefts, holding up my phone and saying, "Smile, you're on camera." Other times, I thought about inviting a few neighbours over, playing the footage on my TV, and letting the whole block see who she really was. But then the fear crept in. What if she retaliated? What if she tried to spread lies about me? Or worse, escalate things? I hated that I was even afraid of her. But the truth is, she had already taken away my sense of safety. I started double-checking my locks at night. I kept the blinds closed, even during the day. It was like living with a shadow over my shoulder. Still, the anger inside me kept growing, and with it, a sense of determination. One evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with all the USB copies of the footage lined up in front of me. I realised I had enough proof to take to the police. But I also knew that once I did, the fragile mask of neighbourly politeness between us would shatter completely. I sipped my coffee, staring out the window at her porch light glowing in the dark, and whispered to myself, "It's time." I didn't know exactly how, but I knew I was done staying silent. The next morning I woke up with a strange calm, like I had finally crossed a line in my mind. I brewed coffee, sat by the window, and watched her house the way I had done so many mornings before. But this time, instead of feeling powerless, I felt prepared. I had proof, I had options, and I wasn't just a helpless victim anymore. On my way to work, I stopped by the police station. My heart raced as I walked inside, clutching the USB drive like it was gold. I half expected them to dismiss me, to say it was a civil issue or too small to worry about. But when I explained what was happening and showed the videos, the officer's expression hardened. He leaned closer to the screen, replaying one of the clips, and then looked at me with something that felt like validation. "This is theft," he said firmly, "and you've documented it well." Hearing those words almost made me cry. Finally, someone else saw it too. He explained that they could open a case, but it would be better if I let them handle it quietly at first. They didn't want me confronting her and escalating things. He asked if I'd be willing to let them set up a small sting. Maybe place a marked package in my mailbox to catch her in the act. I agreed instantly. That afternoon, after work, I went home and tried to act normal. But inside, I was buzzing with anticipation. I avoided looking at her house, even though I felt her eyes on me when I pulled into the driveway. The next day, the officer came by in an unmarked car and handed me a small box. It looked ordinary, sealed with brown tape, but he explained it was marked and easy to trace. We placed it in my mailbox just before the mail usually came. Then I waited. It was almost unbearable. sitting in my living room with my heart thudding, staring at the blinds like they were the only thing between me and justice. Right on cue, the delivery truck passed, and not long after, I saw Janice again. She strolled across the street, her little act of casualness almost insulting at this point, and reached right into my mailbox. She didn't hesitate for a second. She grabbed the box, tucked it under her arm, and walked back to her porch like it was nothing. What she didn't know was that the police were already watching. Minutes later, a patrol car pulled up quietly. I watched from my window, breathless, as two officers knocked on her door. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw her face when she opened it. Shock, anger, denial. She tried to wave them off at first, then gestured wildly as if she was the victim. But when they asked her to step aside, her posture changed. I saw her shoulders drop, her arms crossed tightly, and for the first time, she looked small. The officers walked her to the car, the package still in her hands. I stood frozen in my living room, gripping the curtain so tightly it nearly tore. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt instead was complicated. Relief, yes. Justice, yes. But also sadness that it had come to this. That the neighbour I once trusted was now being led away in handcuffs. I whispered to myself, "It's over." Yet deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished. That night, the neighbourhood buzzed with whispers. From my kitchen window, I could see two of the older couples talking on the sidewalk, their heads leaning close together, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Word travels fast on a quiet street, and the sight of police cars outside Janice's house was enough to spark endless theories. I didn't step outside. I didn't want to be the centre of gossip, though I knew sooner or later people would figure out who had been involved. Instead, I sat on the couch, replaying everything in my mind, from the first missing package to the moment the officers walked her to the car. It felt surreal, like something out of a TV show, only it was my life. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. My heart skipped a beat when I recognised her handwriting. The note inside was messy, written in anger. She accused me of setting her up, of ruining her reputation, of exaggerating something small and harmless. I read the words with shaking hands, my anger rising with each line. Small and harmless. She had stolen from me repeatedly, violated my trust, and mocked me with her smirk. There was nothing small about that. Still, the letter unsettled me. It showed she wasn't sorry. If anything, she was furious at being caught. I worried what she might do next. The police told me later that she admitted to taking several packages, not just mine, though she downplayed it as borrowing. Apparently, some neighbours had also filed complaints in the past, but without evidence, nothing stuck. My videos had finally tipped the scale. She wasn't jailed, but fined and put under probation. That should have made me feel victorious, but instead, I felt hollow. I couldn't shake the image of her standing on her porch, arguing with the officers, acting like the victim. The thought that she might still see me as the villain gnawed at me. For weeks after, I kept my blinds closed and double-checked my locks, not because I thought she'd break in, but because I couldn't stand the sight of her house. Even with her avoiding me, the tension hung in the air. Some neighbours gave me sympathetic smiles. Others looked curious but didn't ask questions. I carried on with my life, but every time a delivery arrived, I rushed outside like it was fragile treasure. My trust was broken, and even though justice had been served on paper, inside I still felt the sting. One evening, as I brought in a new package, I paused at the mailbox, running my hand along its cold metal surface. Something inside me whispered that the story wasn't just about catching a thief. It was about me finally standing up, refusing to be silent, and learning that trust, once broken, is never the same again. Weeks went by, and although Janice kept a low profile after her arrest, the unease in me never truly faded. Every time I stepped outside to check the mail, I caught myself glancing around, half expecting to see her standing there, waiting for another chance. But her yard stayed quiet, her blinds drawn, and her porch empty, except for the sagging flower pots she no longer seemed to care for. It was strange how quickly the woman who once hovered outside every day had disappeared into the shadows of her own house. One Saturday morning, as I was pulling weeds in my front yard, another neighbour, Mrs. Thompson, walked over. She leaned on her cane and spoke in a hushed voice. We all knew something wasn't right with her. She told me packages had gone missing from her porch too. Little things she never reported because she thought maybe she misplaced them. Hearing that both relieved me and broke my heart. I wasn't the only one, but it also meant Janice had been stealing from several of us, maybe for years. After that conversation, I felt less alone. Yet I also felt the weight of being the one who exposed her. Some neighbours looked at me with gratitude, others with pity, but no one spoke to her anymore. Her once friendly waves and small talk were gone. The silence between her house and the rest of the street was deafening. At night, lying in bed, I thought about justice and what it really meant. The police had done their job. She was punished, fined, embarrassed. But was that enough? It hadn't given me back my grandmother's necklace or erased the countless hours of anxiety. It hadn't repaired the way I flinched whenever I heard footsteps outside. What stayed with me most was the realization of how quickly trust can shatter. A neighbour is supposed to be someone you rely on, someone who looks out for you. Instead, mine had been sneaking across the street, taking pieces of my life out of a metal box. That betrayal cut deeper than I ever expected. One evening, I stood by the mailbox holding a package that had just arrived. The sky was streaked with pink and orange. Kids were riding bikes, and dogs barked in the distance. Everything looked normal again. Peaceful even, but as I carried the box inside, I knew something inside me had changed. I would never look at my neighbours the same way. I had learned to protect myself, to guard what was mine, but I had also learned a harder truth, that sometimes the danger isn't from strangers, but from the people living right next door. Life slowly returned to a routine, though it wasn't the same kind of routine I had before. I became more cautious, more guarded. I installed a proper security camera above my garage and even added a motion sensor light near the mailbox. Friends teased me for being paranoid, but I didn't care. I needed to feel safe again. One afternoon while I was watering my plants, I noticed Janice stepping out onto her porch. She looked smaller somehow, like a shadow of the woman who used to smile and chat with everyone. For a second, our eyes met, and in that brief moment, I saw a flash of resentment, maybe even hatred. She turned quickly and went back inside, slamming the door. My hands shook on the hose. It wasn't just about the packages anymore. It was about living next to someone who despised me. Someone who saw me as the reason her life had unravelled. That night, I couldn't shake the thought that she might try to get back at me. Every sound outside made me jump. Every creak of the floor had me on edge. But nothing happened. Days passed and the silence stretched on. Then, about a week later, I received a letter in the mail from the court, confirming her probation terms. Reading it felt surreal. On one hand, it was official proof that what she did had consequences. On the other, it reminded me again of how ugly things had become between two people who once exchanged neighbourly hellos. After reading it, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the pile of mail, thinking about how something so ordinary had turned into such a battlefield. I remembered being a kid, racing to the mailbox for birthday cards, feeling that rush of excitement. Mail had always meant connection, care, surprise. Now it felt tainted, like the joy had been replaced by suspicion. Later that week, Mrs. Thompson stopped by again with a plate of cookies. She patted my arm and told me I had done the right thing, that I had protected all of them by speaking up. Her words should have comforted me, but instead they stirred something darker. Because deep down, I wasn't sure if what I wanted all along was just justice or revenge. Catching her had been necessary, but part of me still longed for her to feel what I had felt. The helplessness, the humiliation, the loss of control. I hated that thought, hated the bitterness in me, but I couldn't deny it. As I sat there with Mrs. Thompson's cookies cooling on the counter, I realised this wasn't just a story about theft anymore. It was about how betrayal changes you. How it plants a seed of mistrust that keeps growing even when the thief is caught. A month after everything happened, I thought maybe the tension would fade, that eventually things would feel normal again. But every time I walked to my mailbox, I felt eyes on me, even if no one was there. The weight of those stolen moments clung to me like a shadow. One evening, I sat outside on my porch with a cup of tea, trying to enjoy the summer air. The crickets were loud, the sky slowly turning purple, and for a few minutes I felt almost at peace. Then I heard her door creak open. Janice stepped out with her trash bag and tossed it into the bin at the curb. She looked up, saw me sitting there, and for a long moment neither of us moved. The silence between us was louder than any words. I thought maybe she would apologise, maybe even try to explain herself, but instead she just glared. A cold, sharp look that made my skin prickle. Then she turned and went back inside without saying a word. I sat frozen, my tea cooling in my hands, realising there was no remorse in her. If anything, she hated me more now than before. That night I dreamed about her stealing again. Except in the dream she wasn't just taking mail. She was walking through my house, opening drawers, touching my things, leaving everything just slightly out of place so I would know she'd been there. I woke up sweating, my heart racing, and I couldn't shake the image. The fear was real, even if the dream wasn't. To calm myself, I started journaling. Every night I wrote down what had happened that day, how I felt, the little flashes of paranoia, the memories of her hand in my mailbox. Putting it on paper helped me untangle the knots in my chest. It was like talking to someone who would never judge me. Through those pages, I began to see more clearly that holding on to anger was only poisoning me further, but letting go wasn't easy. Some days I would read what I'd written and feel proud of myself for standing up, for not staying silent. Other days I would slam the journal shut, furious all over again, wishing I could rewind time and catch her the very first day she stole from me. The push and pull inside me became part of my routine, a battle I fought quietly behind closed doors. Still, I kept writing, kept walking to the mailbox each day, with my head held a little higher, even if my heart still raced. Because even though my trust had been broken, I refused to let her take away the small rituals that made me feel human. Checking the mail, sipping tea on the porch, talking with kind neighbours, those were mine to keep, no matter how much she had tried to ruin them. By the time fall arrived, the air turned crisp, and the leaves painted the street in shades of red and gold. The neighbourhood looked beautiful, almost peaceful. But inside me there was still a quiet storm. I kept hoping the distance between Janice and me would grow into indifference, but every glimpse of her reopened the wound. One afternoon, I was carrying groceries from my car when I noticed her standing at her window, peeking through the blinds. For a split second, our eyes met before she quickly pulled back, and something inside me snapped. I was tired of living in fear. Tired of feeling like a prisoner in my own home. That night, I sat with my journal open and asked myself what I really wanted. Revenge, closure, or simply to move on? I realised that I couldn't change her. I couldn't make her apologise, couldn't force her to feel guilt, but I could decide how much space she occupied in my life. With that thought, I did something bold. The next day, I printed one of the clearest still frames from the video footage, the one where her hand was inside my mailbox, and I slipped it into an envelope with a single note that said, "I see you." I walked across the street, my heart racing, and slid it under her door without knocking. It wasn't about involving the police again or creating more drama. It was about reminding her that I wasn't blind, that no matter how much she tried to act like the victim, the truth was undeniable. When I walked back to my house, I felt a rush of adrenaline, almost like reclaiming a piece of myself. Later that evening, I saw her step outside, holding the envelope in her hand. She looked around the street, her expression tight, her lips pressed together. She didn't wave, she didn't say a word. She just tore the picture in half and went back inside. I expected to feel anger, but what I felt instead was strange relief. She knew that I still had the power to expose her, that her secret wasn't just in the past. From that day on, she stopped looking at me altogether. No more glares, no more letters slipped under my door. It was as if she had finally accepted that she couldn't win against the truth. And in that silence, I finally started to breathe again. Winter came, and with it long, quiet nights where the snow piled up along the sidewalks and the neighbourhood seemed softer, muffled under a white blanket. Life finally began to settle. Deliveries came without disappearing, and I no longer rushed to the mailbox with panic in my chest. Still, every time I lifted the little metal door, I thought about how something so simple had once been turned into a source of fear and betrayal. One Saturday morning, I stood by the window watching the snow fall when I saw Janice shoveling her driveway. She moved slower than before, bundled in a heavy coat, her face pale in the cold air. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger when I looked at her. What I felt was distance, like she was a chapter of my life that had already ended. She glanced my way once, but quickly lowered her head. And that was enough for me. No words were exchanged, no waves, no neighbourly smiles. Just silence, and strangely that silence was comforting. I realised then that revenge hadn't been the answer, not really. Justice had been served through the police, through the footage, through the truth finally coming to light. But the true closure came from me choosing not to carry her weight anymore. I had wasted so many nights replaying the thefts, imagining confrontations, wishing for apologies that would never come. Yet in the end, the power was mine all along. To move forward, to rebuild my sense of safety, to protect what was mine without letting her shadow define me. I still keep the camera above my garage, still check the locks twice before bed. That part of me has changed forever, but I also learned that healing doesn't come from holding on to bitterness. Healing comes from reclaiming the ordinary moments she tried to take away, bringing in the mail with steady hands, sipping tea on the porch, waving back at the neighbours who truly cared. When I think about my grandmother's necklace, the one I never got back, I still feel a pang of sadness, but I wear her memory every day, not in gold or silver, but in the lesson she unknowingly left me. That strength is found not in what others take, but in what you refuse to let them steal from your spirit. And as I close the mailbox now, hearing the simple clang of metal, it no longer feels like a reminder of betrayal. It feels like a reminder that I survived it, that I stood up for myself, and that I will never let anyone steal my peace again.